Warm welcome all of you to our next class. After discussing Windows file system vulnerabilities, we are going to see another important tool, but which also suffers from various vulnerabilities. That is a remote procedure call. As we have seen earlier, remote procedure call it's an inter-process communication mechanism that allows a program running on one host to run code on a remote host. So as you can see in the figure shown here, a client and server are connected by a network, and this client can access a function or a application that is being run on the server. Here, for example, they have shown client is accessing a function namely p. He is passing some parameters x, y, and z, and this function p is stored in server, which will be called as a new normal function call, and the operation will be performed, and answer will be returned back to the client. So this is a strong tool used for file sharing or for enabling inter-process communication. One process may require the help from another process running at a host situated at a distant place. That means from a remote host. So a local system can connect with a function or application running on the remote server, and thus completes the whole work. Now RPC uses client server model. We saw it in the figure shown below. The requesting program is a client and the service providing program is a server. The client step acts as a proxy for the remote procedure. The server step acts as a correspondent to the client step. So the operation is very simple. Client runs a function or application which is actually running in a distant server. Now the problem with this RPC is that worm, namely Conflicker worm, it took advantage of the vulnerability in the RPC to run arbitrary code on a susceptible host. So after detecting the presence of this conflictor worm and its working, Microsoft advised users of this critical vulnerability, and they offered patches to correct this problem also. So the conflicker worm problem is successfully detected by the Microsoft people, and they developed a remedy for it also. So once this patch is installed, then configure worm problem will no longer be a threat. And the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, it's an excellent tool for determining whether a system is vulnerable because of an RPC related issue. So the problem with RPC is that any system can access any function or application running at a server without much hurdles. That's a advantage for the hacker to include their malicious codes inside the function or application being accessed by the client. So a client may be requesting for an application or a function from a server, but if the server is hacked by the hacker, then he can easily return some malicious code to the client, and the client will be also under the custody of hacker. Now we move on to other things. That means NetBIOS and SMB and their advanced tool, namely Common Internet File System. Now this NetBIOS, server message blocks and CIFS all are used for sharing purposes. Recent version of SMB and CIFS are used in latest versions of Windows. Windows 10 is using CIFS and latest version of SMB for file sharing purposes. Now NetBIOS is not currently used, and the actual version of SMB is also not used. They are obsolete. Anyway, the NetBIOS, we start with NetBIOS. Uh, NetBIOS can be compared with DNS to a certain extent. As we know, DNS is used for translation between IP address and the human mm, human familiar alphanumeric values. That means an IP address and a URL conversion is done by the help of DNS. Similar to that, NetBIOS also converts from IP address to a NetBIOS name. It is something that is different from a normal URL. That means NetBIOS is the name of the actual host or a computer where the application is run. That means suppose google.com is a DNS name, then Google can be considered as NetBIOS name. Similarly, en stands for English, en.google.com. If that is the URL used, then we can consider en as the specific NetBIOS name. That means it is a name given to the specific host. The URL consists of this NetBIOS name and other domain names coming in the hierarchy. NetBIOS doesn't follow any kind of hierarchy. It's a flat structure. It is making use of 16 bytes. That means 16 characters will be used as NetBIOS name. So we know that one character needs 1 bytes of storage. So 16 characters will be needed 16 bytes, and usually 15 bytes are used for names, and extra 1 byte is used for identifying the network services provided, what kind of service is provided by the NetBIOS. Now unlike SMB and CIFS, this NetBIOS is not a protocol. It is a service oriented tool which is running over the TCP/IP protocol. So it is just an interface to a network protocol that enables a program to access a network resource. Even files, printer, or other serial ports can be shared with the help of NetBIOS. NetBIOS stands for Network Basic Input Output System. So file accessing, printer accessing, all these are considered as in basic input and output operations. So this just provides an interface using which a user or an application in a local host can access the application running on the remote server. It usually works with the NetBIOS extended user interface. That means this is a protocol used for this remote access. So NetBIOS is working over NetBEUI. It's a fast, efficient protocol that requires little configuration and allows transmitting NetBIOS packets over TCP/IP and various network topologies such as token ring and Ethernet. This NetBIOS is actually working not on internet; it works on local area networks (LAN). That means token ring and Ethernet are two famous LAN technologies used, and Ethernet is currently being used almost everywhere. Even in our labs, we can see Ethernet. Is a technology used for LAN. Now this NetBIOS, it's working on LAN especially, But when internet accessible NetBIOS is coming into picture, uh, it will be and it can be easily accessed or hacked by the hackers. Now this NetBIOS over TCP/IP is called NBT in Windows 2000 server. In 2003, it is NetBT, but for the latest versions of Windows Server, this NetBIOS or TCP/IP is not at all used. It is used in earlier versions of Windows Server only. So mainly this NetBIOS and earlier version of SMB are used for backward compatibility actually. If you are running a recent server and if the server interacts with a older version of Windows client, then for backward compatibility this NetBIOS and SMB are used. If the client is using only NetBIOS and SMB, if it is running an older version of Windows, then NetBIOS over TCP/IP and SMB or earlier version of SMB are required for proper file transfer between the newest new server and old client. Now systems running newer Windows OS can share files and resources without using NetBIOS. So nowadays NetBIOS is not used. CIFS and recent version of SMB are used. NetBIOS is used for backward compatibility. Mm, so that's all about our NetBIOS. Actually, NetBIOS is making use of ports 137, 138, and 139 for file transfer over TCP and UDPs. The main problem with the NetBIOS is that it is susceptible to DDoS attacks, that means distributed denial of service attacks. If NetBIOS is accessed over internet, then it is prone to distributed denial of service attacks. Similarly, for hackers, it is very easy to get the details of systems connected in the network. Um, Many information, including the policies set on the systems. Similarly, passwords used in those systems will be extracted by the hackers very easily. So NetBIOS is least secure, and that's why it is not being used in latest versions of Windows systems. All these things are related to Windows OS only. Windows Desktop OS or Windows Server OS. Now we move on to SMB, Server Message Block. Unlike NetBIOS, it itself is a protocol. NetBIOS is not a protocol. It is working on TCP/IP protocol. Now SMB itself is a protocol. Mm, it is used for again for the same purpose, share files, and usually run on top of NetBIOS. NetBIOS over TCP/IP. Server hacking tools that target SMB can still cause damage to Windows networks. Two well-known SMB hacking tools are Lovetrack's SMB packet capture utility and SMB relay, which intercept SMB traffic and collect username and password hashes. So whenever some client access some information from the server, if it runs some application or a function on the server, there may be many data being transferred between client and server. So in the case of NetBIOS and SMB, as they are lacking serious security measures, they are susceptible to easy attacks. So these two are two hacking SMB hacking tools widely used for stealing the username and password exchanged between client and server using SMB protocol. Now latest version of SMB is supported on newest version of Windows, and a modification of the SMB, that means Common Internet File System. SMB comes in two versions, one is CIFS and another one is SMB itself. Now latest version of OS, Windows OS, they make use of CIFS for file printer or any port sharing purposes. Now we move on to CIFS. It is Common Internet File System, that is a standardized protocol that replaced SMB in Windows 2000 server and later. But to allow backward compatibility, the original SMB is still used. As we stated earlier, NetBIOS and SMB, actual original version of SMB are used only for backward compatibility purposes. Updated version of SMB and the CIFS are used in recent Windows OSs. Now CFS is a remote file system protocol. Again, all these are coming under RPC. They are making use of this facility remote procedure called all NetBIOS, SMB, and CIFS. All these are making use of RPC, and they are providing extended services like file sharing, printer sharing, etc. And unlike NetBIOS, CAFS and SMB, they are sharing resources over internet. So whenever some resources are shared on internet, they are really on danger. They are prone to more attacks than file sharing restricted in LAN only. So in other words, files, folders, printers, and other resources can be made available to users throughout a network. For sharing to occur, there must be an infrastructure that allows placing these resources on the network and a method to control access to resources. So in order to provide security, this AFS enforces many restriction to the resource sharing. That means it shares resource on the internet. Anybody cannot access those resources. They make use of many username and password authentication mechanism in order to place the control for the accessing of shared resources on internet. Now CAFS, it relies on other protocols to handle service announcement notifying users what resources are available on the network and to handle authentication and authorization for accessing these resources. So it incorporates many other incorporates with many other protocols also in order to ensure the security of the resources shared. Now CFS is also available for many Unix or Linux systems as well. Now to share files and folders, CFS relies on SMB, but it offers many enhancements including the following. So the base model of CIFS is that of original SMB, but in order to overcome many security issues that original version of SMB faced, the CIFS incorporates many other features also. We will see the features one by one. Locking features that enable multiple users to access and update a file simultaneously without conflicts that you might have studied in operating system subject. If a process or a resource is shared for many users, there may be many conflicts if the same resource is used by many users. That means in the case of a hardware resource like a printer or something or a serial port, then such a that resource cannot be shared by many users at the same time. But in the case of a file, if a file is shared for many users, then any number of users can access the file at the same time. But there could be a chance of conflicts if somebody is reading a file and at the same time if somebody is changing the same file, then there happens a conflict. So such conflicts must be resolved in the case of a software resource like files. But in the case of a printer, if somebody is using printer, then it will be logged for other users. They cannot make use of the printer at the same time. But in the case of a software resource like file, there could be conflicts. So such conflicts should be solved with the help of some locking mechanism. So if somebody has got access to a file, then either for read or write operation, that file should be locked for the duration uh, through which this particular user is using that file. So as long as that file is used by a file used by a user, the same must be logged for other users. That is only procedure, that is only solution for solving such conflicts. Now second one is caching and read ahead or write behind capability. The same thing happens in the case of files. Read ahead or write behind, that means read ahead means if somebody is modifying the file, some read happening before that will not be successful, that means I will not be getting the updated information. Similarly, write behind also a problem. So that should be that read ahead or write behind must be preserved properly. Now support for fault tolerance. We know that any resource on the shared on the internet or a network is really on danger. Anything can be happen to that particular resource, especially in the case of a file or something. Any kind of modification with the help of some malicious code may be very easy in the case of a file. So such kind of security related issues mm, must be addressed properly. And next one is capability to run more efficiently over slow dial-up lines. If slow internet sharing uh, network is available, then network sharing should not be too slow. So some remedial measures should be taken to for making the file sharing more fast. Similarly, last point, support for anonymous and authenticated access to files to improve security. So if a file is shared on the network and if somebody has got access to that particular file, his details should not be revealed on the network. Instead, we can say that that file is being used by a user. His identity need not be really revealed. If such identity is revealed, then hackers can make use of that particular details to gain access to that particular file, or he can attack the user who is holding that resource. Now, to prevent unauthorized access to these files, CIFS relies on SMB's security model. An administrator can select two methods for server security. One is share level security. That means a folder on a disk is made available to users for sharing. A password can be configured on the user for the share, but it is not required. Similarly, you can go for user level security as well. That means the resources is made available to network users. However, a username and password are required to access the resource.